This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Today is Yud Tes Av, the 19th day of Av, and it's the Yahrtzeit of Rabbi Yaakov Culi. Perhaps you're familiar with the name Rabbi Yaakov Culi. Rabbi Yaakov Culi is the author of a very popular set of Svarim called Meam Loez. The Chavivos of the Sefer Meam Loez, Reb Chaim Chizkiyahu Medini. Anybody know who that is? Reb Chaim Chizkiyahu Medini is a Stei Chemed. Loved this Sefer very much, and when they would read it in the shul before Maariv during the days of Sfira, when they would delay the Maariv, he always would be very attentive to the reading of the Meam Loez. And the great tzaddik, Reb Shlomo Eliezer Alfandri. You know who he was? Reb Shlomo Eliezer Alfandri. He's known as the Saba Kadisha, one of the great Sephardic giants, about 100 years ago. If you remember, the Munkacher traveled from Munkach to Yerushalayim to be able to be Zoicha to meet the Saba Kadisha. He was mechabev the Sefer very much. He would say, when will we be Zoicha to see the Sefer in Lashon HaKodesh? So what do you mean, when will we be Zoicha to see it in Lashon HaKodesh? So what language was it written in? Okay? And he said, very likely, many of the Torahs of his ancestors were shakua in the Sefer. So first of all, what did the Saba Kadisha mean? That when we will be Zoicha to see the Sefer in Lashon Kodesh, what other language was it written in? And what does he mean that a lot of the Torah of his ancestors was immersed in the Sefer? So let me begin by sharing with you a Dvar Torah that the Saba Kadisha himself said over in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Culi. There's a Sefer Amudei Arazim, and the Makubal Rabbi Shaya Asher Zelig Margolis brings that he heard from the Saba Kadisha the following Dvar Torah in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Culi. Rabbi Yaakov Culi was born in Yerushalayim in 1689 to Rav Macher Culi, who was one of the leading families of Crete. Crete, you know where Crete is? Crete is Kandeh, which belonged to Venice, and then the Turks conquered it in 1645. It's one of the longest conquests in history. Okay, so the Dvar Torah is like this. Avram Avinu says, Ulai yesh chamishim tzadikim b'soy choyer. Maybe there'll be 50 tzadikim b'soy choyer. So the question is, there's an extra word in this pasuk. It doesn't have to say b'soy choyer. It could say Ulai yesh chamishim tzadikim be'ir. Why b'soy choyer? Says Rabbi Yaakov Culi, you always have tzadikim in a city. You have people who they sit and they learn. But that is not enough to protect the city. This is a very interesting idea. It's not hard to find tzadikim be'ir. Yeah, it's not fine. You have all over the place people. They sit and they learn. Kol hayom. They're asuk with kedusha. It's not enough to be be'ir. You need to be b'soy choyer. People who their behavior and their voice and their activities influences the city. Because otherwise, why would the Rebbeinu Shalom save the city? Because there's a guy in the corner immersed in his own Avodas Hashem. That's not going to protect the city. You have a guy sitting involved in his own Dalet Amos. He could be a very great tzaddik, so Hashem will protect him, but he's not going to protect the city. Why? What merit? What zuchus? What protection does the city have? Because one guy is being oisek b'Torah. Says Rabbi Yaakov Culi, the tzaddik has to be b'soy choyer. He has to be the tzaddik whose activity has a shot of influencing the people in the city. Otherwise, there's no Hagana on the city. That's what Rabbi Yaakov Culi says. So it has to be Davka b'soy choyer. The lashon of Rabbi Yaakov Culi is that limtzoy tzadikim sheyoshvim va'oiskim b'Torah b'dalet amos b'veisam ze einoi kasha kolkach. Uchshenifratz eza pirtza b'soy choyer elu atzadikim tamirin v'ne'elamin uki'ilu loy hayu be'ir ve'ein goyder gader ve'ein oimed be'peretz uve'ir kazu rishoyim yimshoylun v'yarshiyon va'oisim kol ma shalibam chafetz ve'zeu she'amar Avraham tzadikim b'soy choyer. Okay. So now, in light of this Dvar Torah that Rabbi Yaakov Culi said, and in light of the fact that it was said by the Saba Kadisha, let's learn a little bit about the life of Rabbi Yaakov Culi. So first of all, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, he was born in 1689 in Yerushalayim. Now, we mentioned that Rabbi Macher Culi was born in the city of Crete, the country of Crete. At the time, we mentioned the Turks conquered Crete, so the island's economy was in shambles. So he takes his money and he comes to Yerushalayim in 1688. Who's in Yerushalayim in 1688? Very little. So you had a few Chachamim. Reb Chizkiah di Silva. Who's Reb Chizkiah di Silva? The Pri Chadash. Now the Pri Chadash had recently been in Amsterdam, and he was offered the most prestigious rabbinic position at the time, to be the Rav of the Kehillah in Amsterdam. And the conditions of employment were that you teach us Torah, but you don't tell us what to do. Okay? And he was offered an extremely exorbitant salary. And the Pri Chadash thought about it because he needed the money. And the Pri Chadash turned down the most important Rabbanos in the whole world. And the Chida writes in his entry on the Pri Chadash, actually the Chida writes this in his Sefer Magal Tov, that when he came to Amsterdam, he heard that the Pri Chadash turned down the job. He said, fortunate is him, and fortunate his chelik is in Olam Haba, not to serve in a rabbinic position where his hands are tied. And we have the Pri Chadash today because he didn't take that job. Who else was in Yerushalayim at the time? Rabbi Ephraim Navon. Who is he? He wrote one of the greatest Svarim of Lamdas, the Machaneh Ephraim. You ever hear of the Machaneh Ephraim? I was at his kever, it's in Turkey. I'm not sure how he got from Yerushalayim to Turkey, but he's the author of the Machaneh Ephraim. So Rabbi Yaakov Culi is born here in Yerushalayim in 1689. The Gadol Hadar at the time was Rav Moshe Galante. Now, his father, Rav Macher Culi, marries the daughter of Rav Moshe ibn Chabiv. So Rav Macher Culi marries the daughter of Rav Moshe ibn Chabiv. Who's Rav Moshe ibn Chabiv? He's the author of the Sefer Get Pashut. You ever hear the Sefer Get Pashut? And Rav Moshe ibn Chaviv dies at the age of 42. At the time, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, the grandson, is 24 years old, and he wants to publish his grandfather's Svarim. So he needs support. Who does he get support from? Reb Chaim Alfandri. Who's Reb Chaim Alfandri? The great-great-great-grandfather of the Saba Kadisha. Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov Culi gets support from Reb Chaim Alfandri to support his grandfather's work, Get Pashut. And it was printed by Rabbi Yitzchak Alfandri, a relative of Reb Chaim Alfandri, in 1719. Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov Culi was involved in publishing a lot of his grandfather's Svarim. And now he comes to publish the Svarim in Constantinople in Turkey. Who's the chief rabbi in Turkey at the time? Rabbi Huda Rosenez. Who's Rabbi Huda Rosenez? Rabbi Huda Rosenez wrote two of the most important all-time Svarim. First of all, Rabbi Huda Rosenez appointed Rabbi Yaakov Culi as a member of the Bezdin. And Rabbi Yaakov Culi was publishing his grandfather's Svarim, we said Get Pashut, also a Sefer Shemois Ba'aretz. And on the 22nd day of Nisan in 1727, Rabbi Yehuda Rosenez passes away. During the Avelos, his house was looted, and a lot of his manuscripts were stolen. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Rosenez wrote two of the great all-time works. One is Parshas Drachim. You ever hear the Sefer Parshas Drachim? Parshas Drachim was one of the first Svarim written on Chumash al pi lamdas. So, for example, a good chunk of Parshas Drachim is about explaining the machlokes between Yosef and the brothers when Klal Yisrael had a din of a Yisrael. In other words, we know Klal Yisrael had a din of Yisrael. Did we have a din of Bnei Noach l'chumra? That was one of the machlokes between Yosef and the brothers, because Yosef saw the brothers eating meat, Eiver min achai. Right? Yosef saw the brothers eating Eiver min achai, but really it was shachted, but it was still mefarchesas. So Yosef held the brothers had a din of ben noyach l'chumra. The brothers held they had a din of Yisrael legamri. This is one of the major subjects of the Parshas Drachim. The problem is big chunks of Sefer Parshas Drachim were stolen during the Avelos of Yehuda Rosinus. Who prepared for publishing the Sefer Parshas Drachim? Rabbi Yaakov Culi, the author of the Meam Loez. Okay, so he prepares Get Pashut of his grandfather, Rav Moshe ben Chabiv. He prepares Sefer Shemos Ba'aretz from his grandfather. Then his Rebbe, the Parshas Drachim, passed away. He prepares for publishing Parshas Drachim. By the way, if you look in the introduction of Parshas Drachim, the introduction was written by Rabbi Yaakov Culi, and he mourns the loss of his great Rebbe. And this was just the beginning of the works of Rabbi Yaakov Culi, because Rabbi Yehuda Rosinus left over an even more important work. What's that? He wrote the Mishnah L'Melech on the Rambam. The author of Mishnah L'Melech on the Rambam was Rabbi Yehuda Rosinus. The problem is, it was incomprehensible. Why? It was not prepared for publishing. Big chunks were taken out. It was out of order. Rabbi Yaakov Culi spent 3 years assembling and editing the Mishnah L'Melech on the Rambam. Without the author of Meam Loez, we would not have the Mishnah. It never would have been published. It would have been inaccessible. So two of the great all-time Sfarim, by the way, Get Pashut is a very chashuv, a sefer on Gittin. So that's prepared by Rabbi Yaakov Culi. And Parshas Drachim was prepared by Rabbi Yaakov Culi. And Mishnah L'Melech was prepared by Rabbi Yaakov Culi. He spent 3 years assembling it. And today, many people still struggle. It's a very lengthy commentary. And the logic is very profound. And he clarified certain points. He added explanation. He added his own comments in brackets. If you ever look in the Parshas Drachim, in the Mishnah Melech, and you see brackets, that was added by the author of Meam Loez. It was completed in 1731. It's included in every edition of the Rambam. So now he finished the works of his grandfather. He finished the works of his Rebbe. And now he began to search for a project for his own life's work. There is no question he could have prepared many Lamdisha works, very deep works, halachic works, works of great Talmudic depth. However, what did he choose to write? The Meam Loez. What's the Meam Loez? You ever see the Meam Loez? When I was a kid in the shul, they had like 50 volumes in English of Meam Loez, and in English. Now, anybody know who translated into English? Mostly Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who is one of the most prolific writers of the 20th century. But what's amazing is, what we saw, Reb Shlomo Alefandri, the Sabak. Now we understand, by the way, why the Sabak Kadisha loved so much the Meam Loez, because it was his namesake that helped Rabbi Yaakov Culi publish the Sefer Get Pashut. And it was his family that was very close to Rabbi Yaakov Culi, and he believed a lot of the chidushim of his ancestors were latent in the Meam Loez. But what did he mean if only the Sefer would appear in Lashon Kodesh? So he meant as follows. Rabbi Yaakov Culi wrote imagine if, like, a big gadol b'Yisrael would write, I don't know, the little, the Medrash, a work on the Medrash. Perhaps people would question, that's all he's able to do. Rabbi Yaakov Culi not only wrote the Meam Loez, he didn't write it in Lashon Kodesh. He wrote it in Ladino. Rabbi Yaakov Culi wrote Meam Loez in Ladino, which was the language spoken by Sfardim. Basically, Ladino is Yiddish, the Yiddish of Sfardim. So in other words, what Yiddish is to Ashkenazic Jews, what's Yiddish? It's a mix of German and Hebrew. So Ladino is a mix of Spanish and Hebrew. It was a developed language among the Jews of Spain. And it was written in the Spanish alphabet so long as Jews were living in Spain. After they were expelled from Spain, they stopped using the Spanish alphabet and they wrote Ladino and Hebrew letters. Okay, so the Meam Loez was published in Ladino. The first sefer published in Ladino was published in Turkey. It was a translation of Tehillim in 1540, and then a translation of the Torah in 1547. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Culi gathered all of the midrashim and all of the drashos, and in this sefer called Meam Loez, and it was written in Ladino. Now, it's very interesting. This work achieved popularity that no other work in history achieved. It became one of the most popular Sfarim ever published. Thousands of readers who abandoned religiosity became observant through reading the Meam Loez. It was reprinted at least 8 times in the Mediterranean region, and the volumes were so used that there are almost no copies left of the original editions of the Meam Loez. They were worn out like people's Sidurim or Chumashim. It was very popular among the Sfardim, and it was unknown to Ashkenazim. Now, in World War II, it destroyed most Ladino-speaking communities in the world, and most people couldn't read it. For the first time in the 1960s, the Meam Loez was translated into Hebrew. So that's what the Saba Kadisha means in the beginning of the 20th century. If only somebody would translate Meam Loez into Lashon HaKodesh. Now, when it was translated into Hebrew, the word Yalkut was added. Now, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, he wants to make it accessible, to the English-speaking world and to the Ashkenazic world. So he figures he's going to translate it. The easiest way to translate would to translate it from the Hebrew. He's reading the Hebrew, and he found the translation unwieldy and very unclear, and he decided it would probably be more beneficial to learn Ladino. So Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan studied Ladino, and he said it was much easier for him to translate from the Ladino. So at first he saw a word, Gimel, Vav, Dalid, Yud, Zayin, Mem, Vav. And then after a little bit of staring at the word, he realized that just spells out Judaism. Another interesting expression that he said surprised him, Shiur del Mundo. Shiur del Mundo. Master of the universe. Shiur del Mundo. Master of the universe. Anyway, so amazingly, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan learned Ladino to be able to translate the Meam Loez. So I want to just share with you 2 observations on the Sefer Meam Loez. You have them on your sheet. One comes from this Sefer Zechronim Levracha. I want to thank my friend Rabbi Gedalia Schwartz for getting me this beautiful set. There's a pasuk in Mishlei. It's on page Taf Mem Ches. You have that first sheet from Hagoyin Rabbi Yaakov Culi. It says on top. There's a pasuk in Mishlei. Again, Rabbi Yaakov Culi enjoyed popularity of his Sfarim, really that no other sefer in history enjoyed. I mean, probably until the Art Scroll Shas, there was no sefer that was more popular among the Jewish people. So Hagoyin, Rav Shmuel Aaron Fish, he brings on the pasuk Goimel Nafshoy Ish Chesed, which has many interpretations. One interpretation is, if you bestow upon yourself, you're a kindly person. In other words, there's an idea that you got to take care of yourself. Taking care of yourself is also a chesed. In other words, a person eats and a person bathes. They're supposed to think, I'm doing chesed. Who? To me. Now, don't get too carried away. A lot of people are very, very big bali chasadim. It's called selfishness. But one should think, Hashem gave me a neshama. I have to take care of it. But the Ritva has a different shot. The Ritva says in his Hakdama to Brachos, "Shechesed she'oisa adam im hasheni, ikar hatoiva she'oisa b'zeh hu la'atzmai." A kindness that you do to another, the main benefit will come to yourself. Like the Baal HaTurim says. By the way, this week is Parshas Reis, the Parsha of Tzedakah. Yeah, the pasuk of what? Aser ta'aser. You have the mitzvah of tzedakah. What does the Baal HaTurim say on the mitzvah of tzedakah? V'nasanu. Baal Turim says famously, it's a word that's spelled the same forward and backward. Basically, whatever you give will come back to you. And he brings that when the Mishnah Lamelech passed away, he left over many manuscripts that were not clarified and not arranged. Who arranged it? Rabbi Yaakov Culi arranged all the Chedushim of the Mishnah Lamelech on the Rambam. By the way, who else did he arrange? He doesn't bring it here, but we said he arranged his grandfather's Chedushim, the Get Pashat, Shemois Ba'aretz, in the merit that he took care of his Rebbe's Svarim and his grandfather's Svarim, and he was Mesader Mishnah Lamelech and the Parshas Drachim. He was Zoicha to write and to publish Meam Loez, that his words were spread all over the world. Moreover, even in our times when nobody spoke Ladino, it was translated to Lashon Kodesh, we could add, and it was translated by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, that the reason he was Zoicha, that his Svarim were Neskabel in Klal Yisrael and were widespread and disseminated in Klal Yisrael, is because he did chesed to his Rebbe and to his grandfather, and in that merit, he was Zoicha that his own Svarim were published, were accepted, became popular, and were translated into Lashon HaKodesh, and were translated into English as well. Let's end off with one thing. Again, today is his Yahrtzeit, Yud Tes Av. Let us, here, take a look on your sheets on page Reish Mem Zayin and Reish Mem Ches. Rabbi Yaakov Culi, Mechaber HaMeam Loez, who was one of the Gedolim of 300 years ago, and he arranged the Get Pashat from his grandfather, Maharam Chaviv, and also the Svarim of the Baal Mishlomech and the Parshas Drachim. And despite his Ga'oinus and Torah, he was Mechaber the Sefer Yaakov Meam Loez, that basically is a sefer for the uninitiated. It's a sefer about Divrei Agoda, which translated into Ladino. And in the Hakdama of the sefer, he sort of addresses the fact that probably people are going to mock him. Right? People are going to make fun of him. He says, Maisa maksha yadati bina yiksha mikem alai v'yushum le'Yisrael v'yu malivim asoises ha'kodesh chol Hashemesh yapich l'choshech v'yehofech ish Yisrael u'ma kol hatzayin hazeh. Who is this person who's probably capable of teaching halacha and teaching lamdos and teaching Talmud on a very high level, and he's giving over medrash, meshalim, in the vernacular, in the language of the people, and instead of, he says, ba'asra da'ayel yarka leo bisra, you might ask, instead of serving vegetables, serve meat, amka shel halacha. What about the fact, Talmud Gadol? You're probably going to mock me, you're going to laugh at me, that I wrote a sefer in Laz. But he doesn't explain why he did it. He does say, who is greater than Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Art Scroll. It says Moshe Rabbeinu took the Torah, and he wrote it on stones. Ba'ar Heitev, Rashi says, Shivim L'Shonos. By the way, the Mizrahi says, how does Rashi know from the words Ba'ar Heitev, 70? Yeah? So, take, if you take the word Heitev, and you spell it Hey Yud Tes, Hey Yud Tes Vez, you get 70. I call it the Nana Nachman system of Gematria, right? We had the Mizrahi brings, by the way, the Mizrahi is also one of the Gedolim of Turkey. You take the Hey is 5, Hey Yud is 15, we're up to 20. Hey Yud Tes, what?
24.
Hey Yud Tes is 24, that's 44. And then Hey Yud Tes Vez is another 26, is 70. So it actually works out. Not only is it a gematria, but it's a gematria that actually works. And it's not even off by 1. So that's 70. We once said a similar gematria when the gematria of Teshuvah is Kisei HaKavod. Kaf Samach Aleph, Kaf Samach Aleph Hey, Kaf Samach Aleph Hey Chaf, Kaf Samach Aleph Hey Chaf Vez, Kaf Samach Aleph Hey Chaf Vez Vav, Kaf Samach Aleph Hey Chaf Vez Vav Daled, Gematria Tshuva. That's the story. That's from Rav Shamshin of Ashtrapoli. So be it as it may, he doesn't explain why he did this, although he says Mi lanu gadol mi Moshe Rabbeinu, that translated the Torah for Klal Yisrael. However, the Chida in his entry about not Rabbi Yaakov Culi, but I think in the Chida's entry on Rabbi Yaakov Kuli's grandfather's sefer called Ezras Nashim of Maharam ben Chaviv on Hilchos Iguna, he brings information about Rabbi Yaakov Culi. And let's read what the Chida writes. He says, HaChacham, HaShalem, HaChassid, Va'anav, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, Mechaber Sefer Meam Loez, Lezakois Es Harabim, V'Hamasader HaSefer HaNoira, Mishnah Lamelech, Uparshas Drachim, V'Shamati Mikedushas, V'Chasidus, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, HaNizgar, V'Shkedas HaBetayr. I heard about his Chasidus, his Kedusha, his diligence. V'Ra'isi Kontreisa Mimenu B'Chsav Yad. I saw notebooks from him in manuscripts. Shekamash Shahiyu Mechadshim B'Yeshivas Harav Agado Rav Yehuda Rosenes V'Chaver Havranu Haykaisim B'Shmam. That Rabbi Yaakov Culi would write all the Chidushim of his Rabbi Yehuda Rosenes V'chein Kama Kontreisa Mechadushav, and many booklets of his own Chidushim. V'hu Sider Sifrei Harav Marzikanai Get Pashut Shemois Ba'aretz Ezras Nashim. He was Masader Mishnah Lamelech, and he was gathered all the folios of the Svarim and all the papers. V'chiber Sefer Abar Mishnah Lamelech v'gam Sefer Ashdachim Shaya B'li Seder Ma'urav. He arranged these from that had no order and it was all mixed up. He cut it up to make it readable. V'chiber Darchei Noyam V'ruchai Hukabtzan. And ends off the Chida. V'hikarti toikef pu'ulas tzadik Rabbi Yaakov Culi hafla v'fela. I recognize the powerful contributions of this tzaddik. They're wondrous. Ki haya soifer mahir. He was a swift scribe. Ubaki b'shas. Uvepoiskim. Umefarshim. Uchenir b'sev me'am loyez. Why did he write it? Asher chiber lezakois es harabim. He wrote it to mezaka the rabbim. That he put aside his own aliyah and his own learning and his own ability to raise himself up in order to bring merit to the tzibur. Says the Chida, Ashrav va'ashrei chalkai. Fortunate is he, and fortunate is his chelak. As the Chassam Sofer writes in many places, V'yahavta l'reacha kamoicha zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Says Chassam Sofer, what do you mean zeh klal gadol b'Torah? As opposed to what? Zeh klal gadol b'telephone book? Zeh klal gadol b'a different religion? V'yahavta l'reacha kamoicha. Is that klal gadol b'Torah? What else is it a klal gadol in? Says the Chassam Sofer, it's only in the Torah. Because when it comes to Gashmias, you're not supposed to love your friend like yourself. Let's say you have 1 cup of water. You're supposed to give it to your friend? No. You're not allowed to give it to your friend. Chayecha koydem. So when it comes to the physical world, you love yourself more. When it comes to Torah though, let's say you could learn or you could teach someone else, then v'yahavta l'reacha kamoicha, you're supposed to teach zeh klal gadol b'Torah. In the spiritual world, you have to give it over. You have to give up of your own ruchnius to help your friend. When it comes to the Gashmius world, it's good to give to your friend, but not at your own expense. Chayecha koydem. Rabbi Akiva himself holds chayecha koydem. It's Rabbi Akiva saying zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Happens to be Rav Moshe argues on this, Chassam Sofer, and he doesn't even believe the Chassam Sofer said it. But the Chassam Sofer said it. Chassam Sofer writes it in many places. That when it comes to Rav Moshe holds that if you learned, let's say, 2 Siddharim of Shas, but you didn't learn the others, and you could either teach someone the Siddharim you learned, or learn new Siddharim. Rav Moshe says you have to learn new Siddharim. You come first. Chassam Sofer says no. V'yahavta l'reacha kamoicha zeh klal gadol b'Torah. It's a klal in Torah to put your friend first. But we could say, like we saw from the Hakdama of the Ritva to Brachos, Goimel Navshai Ish Chesed. Ultimately, the one who gains the most is the one who gives over to their friend. Because Yaakov Culi was Zoiche in the merit of compiling the Svarim of his Zayda and his Rebbe, he was Zoiche to write the Sefer Meam Loez. Okay, Rabbi, have a wonderful day.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.